The United States Grand Prix saw over 400,000 racing fans witness Red Bull secure the Constructors' Championship on what was an emotional weekend for the team. There was drama and heartbreak on turn one for Carlos Sainz, while Fernando Alonso put together an incredible comeback until he didn't. All this and more on Unlapped. Would you quantify this and describe this as maybe Lewis Hamilton's best drive of the year?
The way he's driving at the moment, he does look unbeatable in most scenarios.
I feel like the FIA trolls these guys.
They absolutely do.
Welcome to Unlapped, an ESPN F1 show. I'm Katie George. He's Lawrence Edmondson. We're allowing Nate Saunders to catch some much-needed Z's after he traveled back across the pond. Lawrence, I was so sad that I did not get to join you down in Austin. How was it?
It was fantastic. I mean, we were just saying the only thing missing was you, Katie. It would have been lovely to have you along, but it was a great weekend and yeah, really interesting. Obviously, you experienced Miami. Well, Austin's a very different event and it really, I think, still has a great place on the calendar, a really important place because it just offers so much to so many fans. Seeing that many people, especially at turn one, they call it Big Red. That's the name of the corner. They named it fairly recently. And to see all those fans up there on the right-hand side watching over turn one, and of course the drama at turn one was fantastic.
There was so much drama. And I'm just curious. I know Miami, it was in its infancy, first inaugural. I can't believe it's already been 10 years that we've had the United States Grand Prix in Austin. Just kind of what are the biggest differences from your vantage point, having now obviously been to Miami back in May?
Yeah, I mean, those two races are very different. It feels like Miami's set up for VIPs. It feels like a very exclusive event, whereas Austin really is just open to everyone. It's like, you know, if you can get the money together to buy a ticket, you're very welcome to come along. You're going to get great views all around the track, even on general admission. So it's a really, really special place. And I've been coming here since 2012, since that first race. Of course, we did miss one due to the pandemic, but I've been coming back most years, and Austin has completely changed as a place. It's gone from being what was a relatively small place to, I think, you know, a booming place. I've heard lots of people have come over from California, but it really adds to it. It really puts on a kind of party atmosphere away from the track. So the track isn't in the city. You're a little bit further out, but then you get back and it's easy enough to go out and enjoy all the sights and sounds. And the sounds are great because the live music scene here is fantastic of Austin. It's really good.
He says here, because you're still currently in Austin, getting ready to go to Mexico, correct?
That is right. Yeah. So I fly to Mexico tomorrow, which is Wednesday, and get on the ground to do it all over again.
Yeah.
We're nearly there.
Yeah, not a lot on the line, sadly, and we'll get to all of that. But remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment on what you want to hear and learn more about. And don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Let's dive into a quick bit of news because a domino has fallen. Logan Sargent has been announced as the Williams driver in 2023. If he can get his super license, he would be the first U.S. driver in F1 since 2015. Is this similar to the Colton Herta situation with the super license, or do we feel better about Sargent's chances of making it into F1?
No, we feel much better about this. The Colton Herta one, really, he had to go and fight his case because he just didn't have enough points. And the FIA turned around and said, rules are rules. You don't have enough points. You haven't really gained enough experience or got the results to be able to come into Formula One. That's why we have those rules. So Herta, I mean, we can go on and on about how IndyCar maybe should be weighted slightly heavier in that points system, but it's not. So he's out, but it looks a lot better for Sargent. I mean, it's not certain, but it's nearly certain. Really, he has to finish top 6 in F2. He's currently 3rd. There are a bunch of drivers behind him, but for it to go against him, basically, they've all got to have amazing weekends, and he's got to have a terrible weekend. Okay. And really, the odds are that's not going to happen. Plus, he's picking up extra points for FP1 drives. He did one in Austin. So, yeah, that should tip him over the edge. We should have an American driver in Formula One next year. It's just not 100% confirmed yet.
He was obviously down in Austin. I'm just curious, with all the popularity that you've seen, you know, growing and growing and growing here in the States, you're currently in the States, you know, what does that do for the sport overall by placing an American driver on the grid like we saw back in 2015?
Yeah, I think this time is perfect timing. So the problem always is that if you just put a driver on the grid from a country and, you know, he or she is not particularly competitive, then it's tricky. It's tricky to get that kind of momentum going behind them. But because we've had this big boom of interest in Formula One in the United States, because we now had 3 races for next year, Las Vegas joining the calendar alongside Miami and Austin, I think it's perfect. So really, he's a good kid. He seems like a really nice guy. And I think, the talent's there. And okay, he hasn't won Formula 2 this year, but he's been very competitive. He's come in right from the start, and he's also come through the European side of things. So rather than going down the IndyCar route and trying to make the jump across, which I think is much harder, he's gone through the kind of F1 FIA approved route ladder. We often call it the motorsport ladder up to Formula One. So I think he's got, every chance of making it big. And, the fact that so many people in Formula One want an American on the grid. We want someone for everyone to cheer for, when we go to Miami and Austin and Las Vegas. I just hope that Williams can give him a car that means that he's not right at the back. It means that he can get in amongst the midfield at least and show us what he can do.
Yeah, he would replace the outgoing Nicholas Latifi. And of course, we will wait and see if he gets enough points with that super license to be able to join the grid in 2023. Audi teased something that is coming, an announcement that is coming. Now, we don't know exactly what that is. Can you hedge and tell me what you think it could possibly be when they make their announcement on Wednesday?
So earlier this year at the Belgian Grand Prix, we found out Audi were coming to Formula One in 2026. And all they would say is we're going to be an engine supplier. We haven't yet decided who we're going to partner with, where we're going to put those engines, which cars they'll be in. So I suspect this will be the next step along there in that route. And we basically know it's an open secret that Audi are going to invest in the Sauber Formula One team, which is currently known as the Alfa Romeo Formula One team. But that Alfa Romeo sponsorship is literally that. It's sponsorship. They don't really get involved in the making of the car. Audi wants to do it differently. They want to be a real big part of this. They want to use their technology from, that they've had from other racing series and I guess from their road cars as well, and combine it all together into a proper, what we call a factory outfit. So something like Mercedes, Ferrari, and so on. So I hope it's the next step in that. We know that announcement is coming at some point. I hope it's going to be tomorrow because it helps get everyone excited about it, and also it helps with Sauber. If it is that team, and it looks like it will be, that's a great little team, and that was a team that had a lot of investment in the late 2000s by BMW. Funny enough, another German manufacturer. BMW pulled out of the sport around the time of the financial crisis, but what they left there was a very good wind tunnel, some very good facilities, and Sauber's always had a group of really smart engineers. So with a bit more funding and, of course, an engine project to go with it, Audi's hope, at least, is that in 2026, they're going to come onto the grid and be able to, fight right at the front.
Which is extremely exciting. Okay, we'll be on the lookout for that as well. Let's hit the highlights and the lowlights of the U.S. Grand Prix. Where would you like to start? Do we want to start with Max's dominance? We've been having conversations, it seems, week in, week out about that. And again, it was a great race by Max and Red Bull on what was, as we mentioned at the top, an emotional weekend. Do we want to just start with the first corner incident, though? Because the race started out with a bang. It
did. George Russell got it all wrong. And it's funny because for so long, George Russell was the guy that you'd depend on. Because remember, the start of the year, he'd get top 5 finishes all the time. It'd stay out of trouble. We were getting a bit worried about Lewis because Lewis wasn't getting it all hooked together. And now it just seems to turn around. But, these things happen to drivers. They go through periods where they have, freak accident after freak accident or mistake after mistake. And, I think he'll click out of it. But, I mean, I looked at it and I was like, well, that's George's fault. He claimed Carlos cut back in him, but, there was no way Carlos wasn't going to go where he was going because he was trying to get past Max. Of course, Carlos has started on pole position, and we were saying before the start of the race, he needs the race of his life to make this work. And unfortunately, that race lasted really one corner before that contact. So yeah, a bit of a shame, but that's part of what makes racing at Austin so exciting, because you do have that turn one. There's so many different lines you can take, and the one that George took was just a little bit too ambitious. Is it one of the best corners, first corners in F1 from all of the different tracks that you've been at? That's a really good question. It's definitely up there. It's definitely up there because it's unique. I can't think of another corner where you have that elevation change up to a really, really tight first corner. But, we got some good ones around. Suzuka's fantastic. That's high speed going into there. Even places like Mexico, we've got a long old drag down. You start pole position, it's almost a disadvantage because the guys behind can slipstream you and potentially get into turn ones. But yeah, I think it's up there. And you got to remember, because usually when you see it on TV, you see the helicopter views and everything. from the driver's seat, they're so much lower, and they cannot see what's on the other side of the corner. So it's, a blind exit, a blind entrance. You can just about see the apex, but you can't see what's on the exit. So that's also why it's so difficult for them to judge that first corner.
We thought for a second, briefly, that Lewis Hamilton might have his first win of the season, but you knew it's almost like a shark just like swimming down somebody. You just knew that Max Verstappen was coming. And with him being on the mediums, success looked inevitable. Red Bull wins its first Constructors Championship since 2013. Just what have you made of the progress and just the dominance, not only from Max, for an entire season, but from Red Bull in general?
Yeah, it's very impressive, isn't it? And I think for anyone hoping for a competitive formula going into the future, we had these new set of regulations, and they replaced a previous set where we had Mercedes and Red Bull right with each other. Well, at the moment, it looks like Red Bull know exactly what they're doing, and they're making significant progress, and they have done certainly at the end of this year to close everything out, to close out the Drivers' Championship, the Constructors' Championship. And of course, that win on Sunday was just an example of how good that car is. The Mercedes is getting better. It's getting better, and almost everything in that race went against Max a little bit. He'd build a lead. There was a safety car. He then made his final pit stop. It lasted 11 seconds because they had a problem with the front left wheel gun. He got back out. He was in third place, had to get past Leclerc. Not an easy job, because Leclerc's car was quick. It was faster than Max in qualifying. Did that, and then, of course, passed Lewis relatively easy in the end. We saw how fast that Red Bull is in a straight line, and yet it can still create downforce in the corners. So in F1, we refer to that as aero efficiency. It's both fast on straights and fast in corners. And that's what Mercedes is lacking. They're fast in corners, but they're not so fast on straights. And then Ferrari is it's got similar efficiency, but it's just that little step below. So yeah, they've done a great job, and it's going to be a hard winter for their rivals to catch up, because don't believe that Red Bull are going to stop developing. They're going to keep working all the way through the winter to make sure they come into next year with another big step again.
It was somewhat of a somber weekend because Dietrich Mateschitz had passed away, and obviously he's been so pivotal for that organization. What kind of impact do you feel like that had on the weekend for those Red Bull members?
I think it just made them absolutely determined to win. 100% they wanted to do it. It was the Constructors' Championship was a bit of a foregone conclusion, but very, very important for them to get that, because they haven't won one of those since 2013 with Sebastian Vettel at the wheel back then. And that's a long time, because the whole time we've had these turbo hybrid engines, the V6 turbos, which we talked about a lot when they first came in. Red Bull haven't won one of these championships, and Dietrich Mateschitz has invested heavily in that team. He's invested heavily in F1. Of course, he's got two teams, but also, it was his idea to go for the engine project for 2026. So, to see it all come together and for them to start dominating again, which of course is what Mateschitz wanted. That's why he puts the money in there to go and win titles. It seemed like a very fitting way to honor him. And it was interesting because, often when somebody like that dies, you'll see teams go with black armbands as a sign of respect. Well, Red Bull decided they didn't want to do that. Of course, they mourn the death, but they really wanted to celebrate his life. And so one of the nice touches they had were all the senior team members, at least, but most of the team members wearing blue denim jeans, which is which is it was Maschietz's trademark look. So he's an Austrian and a kind of straight talking Austrian, shall we say, to keep the language clean. But he would always wear just his blue jeans and his flannel shirt. And he was, whenever he walked into the room, you knew he was there, because he was such an important figure and such a charismatic figure. But he never changed his look. So it was nice to see that little tribute go out there with the blue jeans.
Yeah, very special. And I was curious as to why, because usually Christian Horner is in his full getup, and I noticed the blue jeans, and I thought, oh, maybe that's a Texas thing, but that's certainly a great touch. What was looking like a special day for Fernando Alonso after what was a wild collision down the straight with Lance Stroll. He came back on the track at 17th, and he finished the race 7th. Question mark, asterisk, no, because then he was given a 30-second penalty after Haas complained to the FIA. Break this down for me, and what was going through your mind when all of this was unfolding, because it looked like an unbelievable crash. He's able to get his way back out and make an incredible comeback, and then it's all ripped away from him in the end.
Yeah, it's a real shame, isn't it? This goes back a few races for the reason that Haas appealed, because Haas on a number of occasions have had the front wing end plate after contact with another driver. I think it's always been on Magnussen's car hanging off. And when bits of bodywork are hanging off and it looks like they're going to fly off the car and become detached, it can happen at high speed. It can go into another driver's path. So the FIA have at their disposal a black and orange flag. It's a black flag with an orange circle in it. Nate likes to call it the meatball flag because I think he's always thinking about food, probably. Anyway, so they wave that at a driver, and it basically means, look, you've got a mechanical issue. We can see it. You're going to have to come in and change it for safety reasons. Now, that didn't happen when Fernando Alonso's wing mirror started flapping around in the wind coming into the car. Obviously, it's going at high speed, so it's getting looser and looser and looser, and it eventually pinged off. I think it did that for over 20 laps, maybe 26 laps, something like that. And so at the end of the race, Haas were like, well, this thing was going to fall off all these laps. Why wasn't he given this black and orange flag? And so that was why they appealed. But what a shame, because it had been a fantastic race for Alonso up to that point. When I saw that car go up in the air, I was like, God, I just hope the driver is okay, first of all. But there was no way in my mind that car would be able to, that car would be able to come back to the pits, have a few repairs, go back out. And even if it went back out, no way it would go from 17th, wherever he rejoined, to 7th at the end. So, it's a shame that result got stripped away, because the stewards did kind of decide that actually, yes, he should have been given a black and orange flag. And the way that they got around that was they're like, well, all we can do is give a 30-second penalty, which dropped him down the order. However, it doesn't end there. It does not end there. Like most things in F1, there's always a right to appeal, and Alpine have taken it up. And they seem to be really leaning on the fact that Haas's original protest appeal was later than it should have been. So you have a window after the race in which you can lodge one of these appeals and or one of these protests. And Alpine claimed that Haas were 24 minutes late on that. So that could be the technicality to get them off. Because if they just reopen the case again, there's no way the stewards are going to look at what they said and say, oh, yeah, you know what, actually, we do feel sorry for Fernando this time. We're not going to do it. They had all the facts in front of them anyway. So the thing that the Alpine protest or Alpine appeal rests on is this 24-minute delay in getting the original protest in there. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. It does seem like a shame that Fernando Alonso's epic drive may not result in points, but he still did it, right? He still went out there and did it. So there's always that.
We'll always remember it.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
When you look at Ferrari, obviously having Carlos knocked out in turn 1 was unbelievably heartbreaking. Charles the most with what he could. Tire degradation has been an issue for this team all year long, it seems. Like, what are your expectations for Ferrari moving forward, looking ahead to 2023? Based on what was supposed to be such a promising year for them. And then obviously it's trended in a downward direction.
That's right. I mean, they started the season and that car looked on par with Red Bull and on several occasions ahead. And it looked like the more reliable one. In those first few races, we had all those Red Bull reliability issues. And of course, we talked about so many times, Leclerc was 43, 46 points ahead of Verstappen, whatever it was, after Australia. That was a huge, huge gap. But of course, it all went away. And part of it has been looking after the tyres, especially since the Belgian Grand Prix, when we had a clarification on what they can do with the floor, and basically certain teams had to slightly tweak their setup, slightly tweak the floors they're running. And it seems like whatever Ferrari had to do to make sure that the car was continued to be legal through the second half of the season seems to have impacted perhaps the setup and what they can do with the tyres, perhaps the flexibility they have to look after the tyres with their setup. So it's something they're aware of. They're absolutely aware of it. And of course, these cars are almost like science projects. They go on track each time and they learn a little bit more, and then those learnings go into solutions that come onto the car either at the next race or probably more likely at this stage next season. So I feel like they know what they have to address, but like I said before, Red Bull are not going to stand still. So Red Bull have this car which looks beautifully compliant. It doesn't bump around like the others. It looks after its tires. It is fundamentally quick, although we saw actually in Austin that the two Ferraris were the two fastest cars in qualifying. But yeah, it's close enough to be in the mix for pole position, and then in the race, it's just on another level, especially in Max's hands. And a lot has been said about Checo Perez this year, perhaps not having an identical car. Some things are slightly different on Max's, but clearly Max has also adapted his style of driving to the car, as Red Bull have adapted the car to his style of driving, and it's married up in this almost unbeatable package that they have now with those two. Whereas I feel like Checo, what he wants from the car, perhaps he hasn't quite got, and if anything, it's moved away from him. So yeah, it's an interesting situation. But yeah, all these drivers, all these teams, they know where their weaknesses are better than anyone, better than us looking in from the outside. So they'll do everything they can to try and address those.
I think you and I have very different understanding of science projects. I was creating volcanoes as a young kid for my science fairs. Okay, not creating an aerodynamic race car, just so we're clear.
Well, that's where it starts. It starts with the volcanoes, and then
the volcano goes up.
If that grabs you, then you can go into engineering, and you go to eventually the ultimate science project, which is a Formula 1 car.
No doubt, no doubt. You talk about kind of the tweaking, right? And you mentioned that Mercedes car, it's fast through corners, not fast on the straights. Would you quantify this and describe this as maybe Lewis Hamilton's best drive of the year?
Yeah, it was up there, wasn't it? I think it probably was. I mean, he's had some good ones, but they've all been a little bit under the radar just because the performance of the car isn't there. But I don't think there was anything Lewis could have done differently. I mean, he even tried to defend the position pretty robustly. Yeah. So yeah, it's hard to point it out. And really, it became quite clear. I think it was maybe 7 or 8 laps out. We were like, okay, there's no way that Max isn't going to just breeze past him on the straight again, because we know about this straight line weakness for the Mercedes. So again, this is something they need to address. And I asked Toto Wolff, the Mercedes boss, about this after the race. Is that straight line speed something which you can easily kind of work into next year's design? And he said, well, part of the problem is the cost cap, which we've been talking about over and over again. But the cost cap is one of the limiting factors, because in previous years they would have manufactured or engineered a whole bunch of low drag components, and they would have tested those on the car, and if that had found a solution, then they may have been able to kind of spend their way out of it, manufacture their way out of it, engineer their way out of it. But this time round, no, they're limited, so it has to go to next year's car. And another interesting thing he said was that the concept for next year's car is going to be quite different. So they've learned a lot this year, and they're going to change it. But he said the way it looks, those distinct side pods, I think he was referring to, but certainly some of the shapes, unusual shapes we see on that Mercedes, may not actually change. But I think a lot of it is what's going on underneath the floor of the car, and the way in which you can ride that. The ride height, the Red Bull runs slightly higher. The Mercedes has always had to be really low. So they're looking at ways to adapt that to make sure they can still get performance, but have a slightly more compliant car that's easier to set up.
Based on that conversation and Toto's demeanor, do you feel like Mercedes can close that gap in 2023 with Red Bull?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big question. One which I don't think anyone can really have a certain answer about, because it really depends. All these teams that after Abu Dhabi will go away, go back to their factories, keep working. They've already been working for a long time, and it's all a big secret until it comes out in testing. But certainly they're confident that the steps they've made towards the end of the season have been the correct steps. So if you remember at the start of this year, all we were talking about was how much that car was bouncing, the awful ride it had over bumps in places like Baku, to the point that it was really hurting the driver's backs.
Injuries.
And exactly, yeah. So it's they got over that hurdle, and now they're kind of working on the actual performance of the car. So they got over what was just a fundamental issue with the car, and now they're working on the performance. So that performance curve seems to be quite steep. Every time they bring something, it seems to get them a step forward. But there are some fundamental things with that car. Again, I think really the way the floor is interacting aerodynamically with how they set up the rest of the car, that's what they've got to adapt over the winter, and then hopefully come back with a car that isn't just quick at high downforce circuits, which is what we've seen with that Mercedes, a car that's quick across all types of circuits.
What did you make of Lewis's post-race comments about how he had doubted himself and was doubting himself earlier on in the year? Were you surprised by that admission? A
little bit, yeah. This is a guy who, we know his record. Really, there is no reason for him to doubt himself at any point. But it's an interesting insight. And of course, at the start of the year, he was really struggling, even compared to George Russell. And part of that, I think, was down to Mercedes experimenting with different setups, going for some quite wild ideas, things which they perhaps knew wasn't going to bring the lap time, but it might open up an avenue of performance and development. And so I think if you're the driver in the middle of all that, you can quite easily get lost, and all the things which you have relied on for years, especially a guy like Lewis, who's always been in a car that's hitting the track and being immediately quick, to suddenly be hitting the track and then making steps backwards from a practice session to a qualifying session, and the car feels worse, and you're struggling even more. That's got to, even a guy like Lewis, that you got to start questioning, is this partly me? So I guess that's what he was getting at. But yeah, I'm pretty surprised he said that, because Lewis, Max, all these top drivers, they are so good that it is surprising they ever question how good they are. But then again, you look at someone like Daniel Ricciardo. We felt for years that he was one of the top 5 drivers in Formula One, and now he can't even get a drive next year and is consistently finishing right at the back. So the confidence thing is very, very important in Formula One.
I think it just reaffirms how important the mental aspect of this sport is, and how you have to be at your best, not just physically, mentally, emotionally, spirit, like all of it matters, and all of it obviously can impact the way that you drive on a given weekend. So I thought that was really interesting from him with that admission post race. Now, Nate loves the doghouse. He loves throwing in tons of people into the doghouse. He is not here, but I'm going to hit you with who you would throw into the doghouse. So I don't know if you want to make room for a lot of people or if you're just going to throw in 1 or 2. I'll leave it to you.
Okay, well, I'm going to throw in one, and then maybe you can add someone so they're not so lonely. We always feel bad about just putting one person in, don't we? Okay, so my choice is going to be Lance Stroll. I feel like he was on for such a good weekend. Like, he was quick in practice. He qualified the car up in 5th. Yeah, there were some engine penalties involved in getting the car that high up there, but he started on a really good position. He was running 3rd, looked amazing. And then it all started to fall apart. And then, of course, that incident with Fernando Alonso, I would lay the blame at his door for that the stewards agreed. Funnily enough, the one person who didn't really feel that way was Fernando Alonso. He said, it was more of a racing incident. But we got to remember, Fernando is going to drive for Aston Martin next year, will be Lance Stroll's teammate. Lance Stroll is the son of the owner of the team, Lawrence Stroll. So I wonder if that had a factor in it. But it's really for that move. I mean, I'll tell you what, you could also put George Russell in there, couldn't you?
I was going to put George in there with him.
There you go. Okay. There you go.
That's fair. Someone who has been steady Eddie, that was a bit uncharacteristic and blew up, obviously, a lot of things very early on. And so I just thought it was a bit too aggressive. And so George and Lance, I think, should hang out for a little bit together in the doghouse. Is that fair?
Good choice. Yeah, that's fair.
All right, so you're going to make a quick flight on Wednesday from Austin. I don't know if you have to connect or not. Austin's kind of a small airport. But you're heading to Mexico.
I do, yeah. By Dallas, which doubles it up, yeah. Nightmare. Anyway.
Okay, Austin to Dallas, Dallas down to Mexico. What kind of racing are you expecting down there next weekend?
Well, the interesting thing about Mexico City is because the altitude is so high, there's just less oxygen in the air. And that, because, again, these are science projects, physics is involved, that has an impact on car performance. So you look at the track layout and it's long straights. Now, usually on long straights, what you'd want to do is trim back the wings and run a low downforce setting. Well, in Mexico, because the air is so thin, they have to run maximum downforce just to make sure they've got any grip at all through the corners. So so it's an interesting one. Yeah, so you actually end up with cars in setups very similar to a Monaco setup, but driving around a track which kind of looks a bit like Monza. And the actual downforce level is actually more towards the Monza level than it is to the Monaco level. So it does create a fairly unique set of characteristics, which means you sometimes get surprise results. The other thing that they have to look out for is that the tires tend to overheat a little bit more because there's just less oxygen in the air. So everything is prone to overheating, both the car's internals and the tires. And so it's a different challenge for mainly for the engineers, but for the drivers as well to manage all that. So I'm looking forward to it. It's a cool race, and also there's this brilliant party atmosphere. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the baseball stadium bit at the end of the lap that they go through, and that is an incredible atmosphere. I mean, the Mexican people make it a fantastic atmosphere anyway, but to then get everyone in that kind of crowd in essentially a baseball stadium with a racetrack going through it, it's pretty special. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Now, we've touted and applauded the Japanese fans for being so creative. Would you put the Mexican fans up there?
Yeah, I think for passion, definitely. And what was interesting was when F1 came back to Mexico, I think it was 2015, if I'm right in saying that, immediately everyone was so excited to be back there. Yeah, all in, packed grandstands. And it's just never changed. They just absolutely love it there. It's a real... there's a real long-standing love of motorsport in Mexico. So I think it's really one of the places that everyone loves to go to because of that, because the fans love F1 and then F1 loves Mexico back.
So we're in this interesting situation and scenario that we didn't obviously experience a season ago. Max has won the Drivers' Championship. Red Bull is now the Constructors' Championship winner. I don't want to disrespect or degrade coming in second place in the drivers' standings. Do the drivers care about coming in second? Like, how do they feel? Because obviously we make it a big deal because we want there to be some semblance of importance for the last few races of the season. But how do the drivers feel about it?
Well, there's the famous quote in F1 that second is first to the losers. And I think that is pretty much how most drivers feel about it. I mean, of course, like finishing second is better than finishing third, right? But Kimi Räikkönen famously said, this was several years ago, that he didn't want to finish in the top three because it meant he had to put on a tuxedo and go to Paris to pick up his third place trophy, which to him has no relevance or importance whatsoever. And he just wanted to have his time off after the season to himself rather than going and shaking hands with people and all that kind of stuff. So it is interesting. I think, you know, these drivers, they're so built to win that, that they want to do it. I mean, it would be nice for Checo, I think, to get second place. It would be his best championship finish ever. So, of course, they'll try and do that. But I think for all those drivers, what would mean more to them than the second place is actually just one win at the end of the season, because getting that victory and carrying that momentum into the winter through all the training they have to do, through all the kind of engineering stuff they have to do over the winter as they get closer and closer to putting the new cars on track, having that win behind you, especially if for Checo it happens in Mexico, you know, that would give him so much so much inspiration, pride, enthusiasm to go into the winter with. So I think that's probably what the drivers are looking at more. And then if second place is a result of that, so be it.
So as it stands, Charles Leclerc is in second with 267 points. Perez is right behind at 265. And then George Russell has 218 points. And then in the constructors, you've got Ferrari at 469 points and Mercedes closely behind at 416. Max obviously tied the record for most wins in a season. Michael Schumacher and Sebastian Vettel held that record tied at 13. Do we feel like he sets a new record and gets his 14th win? Can anybody stop him at this point?
I mean, I think we've got 3 races left. I think he could set it at 16. You know, I really do. Like, if I was going to put money on it, that's what I'd say, because again, we were talking about it earlier, the way that car has developed towards him, the way he's driving at the moment, he does look unbeatable in most scenarios. You know, so Singapore was the odd one, wasn't it? You know, that was basically one of the only races he hasn't won since the summer break. But at the moment, he just looks so unbeatable. So I'm pretty sure he's going to set that new record. And that is a huge achievement. And it doesn't really seem to correlate with where the cars are, you know, because we talked earlier about how good the Ferrari was at the start of the year. And I feel like Ferrari should have won so many more races, taken those off Max this year. But he was there and he won them all. And now he just looks unbeatable. So, yeah, I think he's going to set that record at a new high. And that, I think that is a big deal, you know. It's always hard to know because there's so many records that can be broken in F1. It's always hard to know which ones to put the emphasis on. But yeah, that level of dominance by one single driver in a season is huge, because not only are you beating all the other drivers, you're beating your teammate as well in what is usually very, very similar machinery, if not exactly the same machinery. So yeah, that is impressive.
I feel like I've buried somewhat of the lead and saved it for the end. Red Bull and the FIA had paused their semblance of negotiations at this point because of the passing of Dietrich Mateschitz. Do we feel like a punishment or an agreement will be released by this weekend? Where are we with that as we close? I
think so. It sounds like it's all very close. It sounds like the FIA have basically decided on what they want to what they want to put forward as a punishment. And then it's really a case of whether Red Bull is willing to accept that. If Red Bull is willing to accept that, then it's as simple as that. That's the punishment. And Red Bull essentially have to admit their guilt as well in that process. However, if they're not happy with what the FIA have come up with, they can take it to the cost cap adjudication panel, which would be made up of independent experts, both in finance and usually legal fields. And then they would come up with a punishment, which if Red Bull want to appeal that, well, they then have to take it up to the International Court of Appeal. Now, the danger with all this is that it could go on for months and months. I mean, Christian Horner was talking about 9 months potentially if they take it through all the appeal process. So it's better if they spend a little bit of time making sure that the punishment is fair and just at this stage. And if Red Bull's willing to accept that, then I think that's the cleanest way we can put this all behind us. And we're probably talking most likely sporting penalty, because there's almost certainly going to be a financial penalty. But obviously you can't just leave it a financial penalty, because then you're saying teams, if they want to overspend, all they have to do is just spend more on a penalty.
Exactly.
and then they can do it. So it would completely defeat the purpose. So there has to be a sporting element. It looks like it's going to be a reduction in wind tunnel time and CFD capability for next year, and that's significant because that really will limit how much Red Bull can develop their car in the following year. And if you do believe that the extra spend that Red Bull put into last year's car, we're talking somewhere in the region of $1.8 million, had a big impact on the advantage they took into the start of this season. Well, knocking about 20%, 25% off their wind tunnel time would peg them back significantly. So we'll have to wait and see what comes out. I'm pretty optimistic we'll get something ahead of this weekend, but you know what? There were times in Austin when I was told it's going to be tomorrow, and it wasn't tomorrow. So I'm
not holding your breath.
I'm not holding my breath on it anymore. And I just want, when it comes out, that it's that it's all fair and that there's not really any loophole that Red Bull can appeal, and that it's at a position where everyone can move on, accept what happened, and kind of accept that perhaps Red Bull are going to take some punishment going forward.
I have to know, what was the air in the room like when it was Zach Brown and Christian Horner splitting their media time together?
Yeah, that was intense. That was very intense. And credit to the FIA in how they set up their press conferences, because they
always do that. I feel like the FIA trolls these guys.
They absolutely do, and they know we love it as journalists. So yeah, they put them sat right next to each other, and it's great. And Christian would talk as if Zach Brown wasn't in the room, and Zach Brown is a important man. He's quite a presence when he walks into the room, and yet there was Christian just really kind of saying stuff like, this guy, what he said is completely unacceptable and all this kind of stuff, and Zach's just sat there like. Of course, Zach then says his piece, but that was a bit awkward and very tense, but kind of fun to watch at the same time.
I'm going to let you off the hook because Nate's not here to compare, but you just have to give me your race winner.
Okay.
And it can't be Max Verstappen.
It can't be Max Verstappen.
No.
Okay, actually, you know what? I'm going to go with Lewis Hamilton.
Okay.
Because, again, we were talking earlier about the weird Mexico City atmosphere, essentially, that means that cars have to run in high downforce settings. Well, every time the Mercedes run in a high downforce setting, it's actually been very competitive. So I think something would still have to happen to Max for Lewis to win. But I think that Mercedes, again, are going to be right up there competing at the front like they were in Austin.
Awesome. Well, we can't wait to watch, and we'll be reading and following along with your coverage. Safe travels, as always. Thank you for the time and your analysis. I'm sorry that I missed you in Austin, but we will get together here soon, hopefully, maybe in the off season before we get going with our 2023 coverage. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening to another episode of Unlapped. Be sure to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content, and be sure to give us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Cheers.